Hello, guys and girls. The program you are about to hear will be both fun and educational, but it is not a substitute for medical advice. Although we are doctors, we are not your doctors.
Hello and welcome to Travel Medicine. As always, I'm your friendly neighborhood internal medicine doc, Dr. J.
Hey all, Dr. Santhosh here, pediatric infectious disease doc and researcher. How
And
y'all
we
doing?
and we are still in February in the middle of a heat wave in Chicago.
This
58
is,
degrees today.
yeah. The, by the way, all of you wonderful people who are listening to us, thank you, thank you, thank you. Uh, he's being sarcastic if you're listening to this in real
I'm
time.
not.
Yeah, it is uncharacteristically warm. Out here in normally sunny Southern California, we have been hit by I think it's called a river or something like that, some sort of an above ground
Oh
climactic
yeah.
river.
Oh yeah, the
Uh,
LA River actually has water
no,
in it.
no, that's not it. No, no, the climatic but essentially it brought in and dumped the equivalent of maybe 3 months worth of rain in 2 days. It was crazy over here. Yeah. So
Now,
I'm wishing I was in Chicago where it's warm.
now listening audience, you may wonder what, if anything, this has to do with this week's topic.
Yeah, I mean I'm a little curious myself and I know the topic.
We're going to find out that climate change or discussions of statistics were used in an epic smackdown in a new segment that Santhosh and I are introducing for Black History Month called
Who charted? I absolutely love Who Charted.
for one of our first Who Charted. We're going to talk about the achievements of a few figures who deserve more than just a quick byline. And to start, I figured we could talk about to talk about the first African American physician.
Yes, so we're not talking about uh, black doctors of kind of all stripes because if we go back into antiquity we have people who are practicing medicine of all colors, genders, races, all kinds of things as far back as you can think. But once the MD, the medical doctor, I should say credential or degree was created and boarded in the United States in the 1800s. We're talking about the very first African American to earn this degree and practice medicine here in the United States. And Josh, I was kind of when you introduced this gentleman, I was a little shocked at how early this happened.
So let's start with the story of James McCune Smith,
Hmm.
born into slavery in 1813 in New York City to Lavinia Smith and an enslaved black woman from South Carolina, and Samuel Smith, a white merchant slave owner.
Oh, okay. So, a very sadly too common story in this one. So, I just to start things off, is a gentleman who was born as an enslaved person and then went on to earn his medical degree. What's your excuse? Is what I'm saying. All y'all in 2023.
He was legally freed after New York passed the Emancipation Act on July 14th, 1827, and he was 14 years old at the time. He continued to work as a bonded blacksmith uh, 6 days a week, and then he was studying to prepare for college Greek, Latin, as one does. Graduated with honors from the African Free School Number Two, which was a school founded by an abolitionist.
Yeah.
Despite all his accomplishments and intelligence, he was denied admission to medical schools in the United States because he was black, but was accepted to the University of Glasgow.
He had applied to Columbia. They said no. And then Geneva Medical College in New York State, not Switzerland. So they said no. And so I guess one of his mentors, who was actually a reverend, said, hey, go across to old country.
On graduation, also with honors, he got a triple degree, a BA, an MA, a BA, an MS, and then an MD. He was awarded a prestigious gynecological residency in Glasgow. Try saying that 3 times fast.
Prestigious gynecological residency in Glasgow. That is difficult. That's tough.
Based on that experience, he published 2 articles in the London Medical Gazette, which are not only the very first scientific articles published by an African American in a scientific journal, so that's already impressive,
Yeah.
but they also were published to expose the unethical use of an experimental drug on non-consenting patients.
Oh, wow. So I don't have the contents of the actual papers that he published, but this was massive. So he was looking at medical practice as well as ethics at the same time, and very, very progressive for his time, ethics as it pertained to the care of women, which was horribly neglected, which is still neglected today.
The letter itself, when you read it, is very polite and kind of is like, hey, administration officials, I just wanted to make you aware that when this doctor is staffing the hospital, it is always full to beds, whereas when this doctor is staffing, we mysteriously only have about 4/5 of our patients. And then let me drop
Oh,
some knowledge on you about why that may be.
okay.
So you're
Oh,
about to
very
hear
interesting.
some statistical smack talk, and this is going to be a recurring theme.
So in this case, Dr. McCune Smith charted.
Yes. And
Okay.
here's some of the things he charted.
Hmm.
He discovered that Alexander Hannay was one of the senior doctors in the hospital, was treating women suffering from gonorrhea. This was a women's hospital. A lot of the women were there for venereal disease,
Okay.
among other things. But for our story, and this Dr. Hannay was treating women suffering from gonorrhea with a drug called silver nitrate. Are you familiar with silver nitrate, Santhosh?
Yes. So silver nitrate, either as a tincture or as a patch, is still used in this day and age for treatment of burns. Specifically, you use it as a covering to prevent infection when you have burned and exposed skin. It's not a fantastic antiseptic to use on an invasive basis because essentially silver nitrate just destroys cells in general. It doesn't care if it's bacterial cells or human cells or whatever. So you tend to cause quite a bit of tissue damage along with trying to kill the bacteria. And oftentimes that's a losing battle. But we are, in 1837, we're close to 100 plus years before the advent of any modern antibiotics. So that's what we had.
So, yeah, doctors would use this as a topical treatment for infected skin tissue or to cauterize and stop bleeding. But
Mhm.
that was in low concentrations in a solution and then applied as a last resort. Dr.
Yeah,
Hannay,
when you couldn't figure out any other way to treat said disease, then you'd go to this.
Dr. Hannay was administering the drug in a solid form, so highly concentrated, and he thought this was rather innovative. And, when his patients were like, could you please make something less painful? Because as you can imagine, you need a topical thing to smear on the surface of a skin. If you were trying to treat an inside cavity, you're using a much larger, more concentrated, and therefore more painful treatment.
Yeah, and that burning sensation that they're talking about is not minor. Some of us have experienced it, Josh, if you're old enough to have had a mother or father or parent apply iodine on a cut or open wound, but imagine that he was applying this substance into the vaginal canal on the mucosa. Ow. Gotcha.
So
Okay.
Dr. McCune Smith, during his investigation, realized he couldn't just make the accusation on a case of word against word. He'd never be believed. So
Right.
instead, he got figures from the hospital registers that recorded the condition of patients being treated in the hospital over an entire year. This was
Okay.
part of a new science being developed at the time called statistics.
So he was performing a retrospective study. Okay.
And as a result of this, he was able to bring the receipts and show that a lot of the patients under Hane's care weren't actually doing well. They were suffering miscarriages, illnesses, another bunch of, well, if not causation, then some pretty suspicious correlation in side effects. But all of those were being left off the hospital registers, hence the decreased number of beds reported whenever that doctor was on staff. He was tinkering with his results in order
Oh,
to make his treatment look better. And if it's
okay.
one thing to hear an accusation from some kind of minority figure, which is already bad enough, but even if you try and brush that off, he brought all the evidence that said he could not be ignored, and this is scientific fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only, experimenting on these women, but just absolutely wrecking your actual, monitoring. Uh, as if, for instance, if Hene actually did have good results, with this rather barbaric and horrible treatment that he devised, he wouldn't have record of that either, it's kind of a stupid thing to do.
The end result, of course, is he brought attention to the plight of these women who he interviewed directly to gather some of his evidence as well. Now,
Yeah.
now this
Okay.
is not an isolated trend for him. He was hired later in 1846 to the Colored Orphan Asylum because they had 200 children in residence, and 1 in 20 of them were dying from measles, smallpox, or tuberculosis. Measles, for
Oh,
which there was no vaccine,
right.
tuberculosis, for which there was no antibiotic, and smallpox.
And I think by that time we had variolation. So we did have immunization for smallpox. Just to clarify, Josh, this was after he had returned back to the United States, right? He came back to Manhattan to work.
That's correct. This is in New York.
Gotcha,
And
gotcha.
the
Okay.
second he landed there, he started debunking claims that homeopathic treatments reduced death rates in orphanages. My kind of guy.
Oh, my hero. Yeah.
Writing that allopathy, which is what Western medicine is,
It's
saves
called.
saves 7 times more patients than homeopathy, and arguing
Yeah.
that homeopathy is the most deadly quackery that curses the 19th century.
And the 20th and the 21st. Although it's being like followed up by a lot of other quackery like anti-vaccination right now. So for people who don't know, homeopathy is straight up quackery. I believe the founder proudly stated that it had really no scientific basis. It functions on a weird, completely unproven principle that like can treat like. So you can use gonorrhea to treat gonorrhea, kind of a thing. It's a little, piece of insane. Allopathy at that time, which is what we've now called medicine, it's a little bit silly, Josh. It's actually a name given to us derisively by other types of physicians because allo means other. So we were like, oh, the other medicine, you know.
Well,
So
to that
yeah.
point, Smith regularly gave vaccinations for smallpox and decreased the mortality rate by somewhere between 5 and 10% in that orphanage.
Oh, way to go. Wow.
In 1840, he wrote the very first case report called A Case of Thylism with Fatal Termination, which described a woman with excessive salivation,
Hmm.
glossitis, which is inflammation of the tongue, and gingivitis, inflammation of the gums, after ingesting a prescription for medical mercury who died as a result. But because of discrimination, he couldn't publish his work in any medical journal.
Oh, okay.
Now, a white physician came along, read Smith's case before the New York Medical and Surgical Society, and of course they published it under another name.
Oh,
Well, his case report, though, preceded the first published account of what we call sialuria, which was in 1842 in PubMed. So he did it 2 years
oh,
before it was published by a white physician.
oh, okay. So he observed this effect from uh, mercury poisoning, essentially, and
Hmm.
published it. So he wasn't the first black person to publish this case and identify this disease. He was the first person.
Yes.
Okay, got it. And he wasn't allowed the credit he was due. Oh, okay. All right.
Now, he did finally manage to start breaking into more traditional medical journals and became the first black physician to publish a paper in the formal medical literature, which was a case series of 5 women whose menses had stopped as a result of opioid use. This was
Okay.
earliest evidence of narcotics diversion. So, describing an 18-year-old woman who took a prescription to treat menstrual cramps, who, without his knowledge, continued using the pills, and it hinted at social determinants of health. So, you have social medicine, addiction medicine, women's health, which is, again, themes that you keep seeing him advocate for. But I think my absolute favorite
Okay. Okay.
would be his response to John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of State at the time, fusing his medical activism and scientific rigor to debunk medical racism.
Oh, okay. So Smith or McCune Smith, Dr. McCune Smith, took his ability to speak, truth to power, that kind of a thing, and all of his experience and ability with statistics and science and medicine and everything. And he shot down an opinion of not just like a high ranking official, but like Secretary of State. So what was the Secretary of State saying, and what did Dr. McCune Smith need to debunk?
So Calhoun was pro-slavery, a former U.S. vice president, a senator from South Carolina who favored secession, and basically used the 1840 census to criticize the abolition movement, saying, in all instances in which states have changed the former relation between the two races, the condition of your people, instead of being improved, has become worse.
Oh,
Now, there's a lot of
okay.
ways to respond to that.
Sure. And this was like an opinion paper, right? He had the census, which basically had raw numbers, I'm guessing, on number of patients that were taken in and diagnosed with insanity, along with their race, sex, all that kind of thing. And he was able to show, I guess, just with that, oh my gosh, there's a lot more insane people of color, Black Americans, African Americans, than before there was slavery.
Well, a simple 1 or 2 word response to what essentially was a campaign speech or frequent jibe wasn't going to
Sure.
be sufficient.
Right.
So, Dr. James McCune Smith wrote a dissertation on the influence of climate on longevity.
Okay. All
Remember our
right.
weather references in the beginning?
Oh, you're bringing it back around. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
So, he published this in 1846, drew on
Okay.
geography, references from the United Kingdom and France, as well as the field of biostatistics, to question all of the claims. He compared mortality rates with latitude coordinates to show that people lived longer in states that abolished slavery, like New Hampshire and Connecticut, than in Georgia, where it was legal. Next, he stratified mortality rates by age, race, and place to calculate that people in New England lived longer than the South, and boldly
Hmm.
wrote that the categories in the census were socially constructed, not biological. So he said you should
Oh,
estimate all of my people free and enslaved together, irrespective of the division in the census, because the vast majority of those free in 1830 or 1840 were slaves 20 years before. And then he went on to show through the same census info and other papers that there was a greater difference in mortality between 2 counties in Georgia that had slaves than between all of New England and the South. So he basically said a lot of socioeconomic factors are what is having us die young or do poorly. And when we can get into better circumstances, you can actually live just as long or longer. And this wasn't kind of
Wow.
really studied again until, or commented on until 175 years later, when we noted higher mortality rates among racial and ethnic populations due to COVID should be also analyzed by modeling socioeconomic status.
So much to unpack here, which is absolutely elegant and beautiful. So, first and foremost, he left behind the argument about insanity because he realized that that was a medical diagnosis and that was going to get thrown around. So, kind of who cares? But he focused on mortality and then dug really deep into, how poor are they? How rich are they? What other standards of living are people living under that would affect their longevity and their mortality? And then, one of the earliest things that I'm hearing about actually from Dr. McCune Smith here, which is, a that if you just look at race as oh, that person looks black, that person looks white, you're not actually looking at their differences in biology, because you're actually using a poor correlate. And so you actually need to look at their biological differences, which you probably couldn't in that day and age of science. But showed really, really beautifully here that, the power of statistics. There were good reasons why you had differences in longevity, but even more so, taking it a step further, than if you looked at the right correlates, and constrained your investigation properly. Mr. Calhoun, you are wrong. You're actually you're no, we did not do better under slavery, sir. I've got to add over here, Josh. This was a little bit of a failed follow up attempt, but it's important. House of Representatives tried to call for an investigation of the census results to see if they could be recalled or reanalyzed. The person who called for that recall of the census and that reinvestigation, John Quincy Adams. Well, while he was a representative, but yeah, Calhoun just put like pro-slavery, jackasses, up, and he took them and he appointed them as part of the census machine. And that person said, "Oh no, this census is flawless," and so it was never officially changed, but the challenge still stood.
And then just, in retirement, he opened up the very first African American owned pharmacy in the country. But that brings us to a break when we will come back with another episode of Who Charted?
We'll tell you after this.
And we're back.
Hey, were those some fun commercials? Sorry.
So, Santhosh, I told you
Yeah.
my story. Who did you chart? Who charted who?
Oh, I don't know that I can outchart you. I learned so much about Dr. McCune Smith just now, and I'm excited to read more. I definitely do want to. One of these days, I'm visiting Glasgow, and I'm going to, take a look at all the information I possibly can about him. But I'd actually like to, put the Wayback Machine in a little bit of a fast forward from when Dr. McCune Smith was working. And do you mind if we come up to about 1910?
Sure, take the wheel.
All
Joystick?
right. Yeah,
Control panel? How do we?
control yoke. Yeah, I don't know how this stupid thing runs. You just you ordered it out for off of like eBay one day, and you were like, "Hey, we have a Wayback Machine."
Anyway,
Uh, yeah,
onward and upward.
onward and upward. Yeah. So let me take you over to Louisiana, and we have, passed the days of chattel slavery, and now there is recourse for Black people, African Americans, to attend colleges and even to advance to medical degrees and beyond. But we are in the Jim Crow era. So I'd like to introduce you here in Louisiana to Mr. Viviene Thomas. And this young man was born to Willard Maceo Thomas and the former Mary Alice Eaton. And these folks wanted to set him up as much as possible. They knew from a very young age that he was quite prodigious. So he went to high school, and he was actually, they moved out over to Nashville, Tennessee, graduated in 1929. And during this time, Vivian really learned to work with his hands. Dad was a carpenter and passed on just everything he could to his sons, including to Vivian. All right. So Vivian goes to Fisk University. He has a carpentry job. He's repairing facility damages and all these kind of things. And he had his sights set on becoming a doctor. And he was ready to go. He was ready to go over to Vanderbilt and take his exams, all this kind of a thing. But then it's 1929. We're coming up to 1930. And Josh, we are square in the Great Depression. And now there is no, don't even worry about money for education. There's no money to live. So Thomas went ahead and put his educational plans on hold. And he went around and looked for a job. So he asked around and he said, "Here, I'm interested in being a doctor. I know that's not going to happen for me right now, but anybody and everybody who can get me into a medical profession,
Well,
please
this
help me
is
out."
this
Yeah.
is one of the things I love is his story. You've seen Good Will Hunting.
Yes. Yeah. This, this is a little like that. Only
I
he
just
wasn't
I
such a little
just
punk.
I just want well no, I want our listening audience to be able to properly visualize
Yes.
the story
Yeah. Yeah.
because in an era when institutional racism was still the norm, Thomas was classified and paid as a janitor despite the fact
Yes.
that, he's doing the work of a postdoctoral researcher.
He was, yeah. So he started out, and Dr. Alfred Blayloch, which is we'll talk about as a big name in cardiothoracic surgery, took him under his wing and said, "Hey, I'm going to have you put my the dogs to sleep because we're going to be doing experiments on the dog. We're going to have you put them to sleep with anesthesia." And Vivian would start out, and you're absolutely right, Josh. After the first day of work, um, Blaylock actually said, "Okay, we'll do another experiment." Took it a couple of, and then boom! In a few weeks, Thomas is doing the surgery on his own. So Dr. Blaylock would describe the surgery that needed to be done on that experimental animal, and he'd walk out, and Vivian Thomas would be doing the surgery, Josh. is is absolutely crazy. So you know he stuck with Dr. Blaylock, and prior to his big contribution at Johns Hopkins, they were at Vanderbilt, and they worked on hemorrhagic and traumatic shock. They worked on research regarding crush syndrome, which is what happens when you have a bunch of inflammatory markers and myoglobin that just releases into the blood when a limb gets crushed. And this research actually saved thousands of soldiers during World War II. So it was very, very important. And so, both Thomas and Blaylock, well, sorry, Blaylock got all the recognition, but Thomas stuck with him the whole way. And after they were working through shock, the vascular bed, fluid replacement, Dr. Blayloch and Viviene Thomas turned towards the cardiac surgery, and they actually moved over to Johns Hopkins. So yeah, this one of the models that they were working on, and this is a scary syndrome in babies, and it's one of the things that you absolutely don't want to hear as a new mother and father. There is a syndrome of the heart, a congenital heart disease called tetralogy of Fallot, and essentially, what happens in this disease is that the blood that's supposed to be going to the lungs and the blood that's supposed to be going out to the body is mixed. And so the baby actually looks partially oxygenated or blue. So the Dr. Blayloch and Viviene Thomas had been working on this dog model of a blue baby, trying to figure out what to do, how to actually kind of palliate this child for a while before you could do the definitive surgery to actually correct this congenital malformation. Well, Alfred Blayloch kind of hooked up professionally with Dr. Helen Tausig, who is another wonderful cardiologist, and she was looking for a surgical solution to blue baby syndrome, and she goes up to Blayloch and Thomas, and in a very professional way goes, "Hey, maybe we can reconnect the pipes." I do want to make very sure that everybody knows she did use the terms "reconnect the pipes," Josh.
That's verbatim, folks.
That's verbatim. She said it might be. We can save these babies if we can reconnect the pipes. So they took their work from Vanderbilt, where Blayloch had and Thomas had gotten very, very good at rerouting blood in these dog models of various cardiac diseases. And he found a way, and really, it should be that said that Thomas really found a way of joining the subclavian artery, which is the artery that runs right under your collarbone, to the pulmonary artery, which supplies your lungs. And so now you've got blood flow, much better blood flow to the lungs, and the oxygen gets much, much, better oxygenated. Thomas had, all of his dogs and everything else like that. And one of them, he's named Anna, was the first long-term survivor of this procedure. And because of that, Anna actually is the only animal who has her portrait hung on the walls of Johns Hopkins in the medical school.
In order to successfully repair this tetralogy of Fallot, Thomas was the one who developed, in 1946, a new surgical technique for improving circulation in these transposed elements. It was called an atrial septectomy. This was executed so flawlessly, after all that practice it should be, that Blayloch, upon examining the nearly undetectable suture line, was prompted to remark, "Viviene, this looks like something the Lord made." Remember that phrase, because he was later taken. There was a photo of him taken as this procedure was performed to a more general audience, with Thomas standing on a step stool to coach Blayloch over his shoulder. And that is in a documentary called Partners of the Heart. You have to appreciate that pun. Gets you right in the subcockles.
It really does.
I believe, Santhosh, you were about to talk about a film made about it, a fictional film, as opposed to Partners of the Heart.
Yeah. This was more of a docudrama, and it stars Professor Snape. Help me out, Josh.
Alan Rickman.
Alan Rickman. Yeah, the very dour actor who represented Dr. Snape so beautifully on film. But Alan Rickman as Alfred Blayloch, and this, they went ahead and named this movie, this documentary drama, Something the Lord Made. And it is really beautiful. It is kind of, over dramatized, and there's several parts of it that's not terribly accurate. But I think it shows not only Thomas's skill and everything that he did in order to create this shunt and this surgery. But I think it really shows the beautiful relationship between Vivienne Thomas and Dr. Alfred Blayloch. Dr. Blayloch essentially could not have done what he did without Vivienne Thomas. In the first case, Josh, what you were saying, 1944, when they performed the surgery on the first human infant, literally with Vivienne Thomas over Dr. Blaylock's shoulder. Not only that, but because of Thomas's technical skills, um, there were no such, clamps and needles and everything. Like the instruments that you needed to actually perform the surgery on a baby this small just hadn't been invented yet. So Thomas actually had adapted the needles and clamps himself. So he was welding, he was forging, he was suturing. I really have to give it up for this young man. And for the longest time, Josh, the shunt, this anastomosis was called the Blayloch-Taussig anastomosis. But especially in recent times, there's been a big push whenever this surgery is done on a child with the blue baby syndrome. They'll say, "Oh, we're going to put in a BTT shunt, a Blayloch-Thomas-Taussig shunt."
That is a fantastic story, and I'm glad to see Dr. Thomas getting the recognition he deserves.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's and throughout this entire thing, still called a laboratory technician, janitorial salary. I'm a little sad to say he did not get the recognition that Dr. McCune Smith did in terms of earning a degree and being kind of on the forefront and prominence of his field.
Well,
He
he
was
did
very,
get
very much in the background.
he did receive
Oh,
an
sorry.
honor he did receive an honorary degree from John Hopkins in 1976.
Oh, yes, he did. This was, kind of a while after he had been out of practice. But yes, it was an honorary doctorate. And it had to be a doctor of laws rather than a medical doctorate because of certain restrictions, but still really, really important. And yes, you can see his name everywhere at Johns Hopkins as one of the pioneers of cardiac surgery.
And next, we will close out with one more short story. We've talked about two great men in medicine. We should at least give a nod to a great woman.
100%. Let's do it.
No one docks like Gaston, watches talks like Gaston, unblock circulatory clots like Gaston. The first
Uh,
black female to direct public health service. Her research is groundbreaking to none. For she established some nationwide screening, and by the 1980s, 40 states had it done.
Woo!
So let's talk about Marilyn Hughes Gaston.
I'm guessing she wasn't a muscle-bound brute who went around slapping books out of young maidens' hands.
She was a pediatrician
Yay!
who was involved in some pretty groundbreaking research on sickle cell disease. Now, she knew she wanted to become a doctor at age 9 when she witnessed her mother fainting in the living room and didn't know what to do. Because her family was uninsured, her mother wasn't getting any health care, and that's when she wanted to be able to change the situation. Now, that sparked her original interest in medicine, but during her residency at Philadelphia General Hospital, she was admitting a baby with a badly swollen hand, but no evidence of trauma.
Oh, okay.
Her supervising resident suggested that she check for sickle cell disease due to the race of the child, and sure enough, the baby did have the condition and the swelling was from an infection.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So, for those who don't know, sickle cell disease is prominently, uh, I should say, much more common in people of African descent, Middle African descent, and parts of Asia as well. And it co evolves in areas where malaria prevalence is extremely high. The reason for this is if you actually just have the sickle trait and not the disease, you're somewhat resistant to getting severe malaria. If you have the disease, however, this is a mutation in hemoglobin, the beta chain of hemoglobin. And what ends up happening in cases, especially when there's low oxygen tension, so especially at the very tips of your fingers and hands and feet, the red blood cell, rather than being a malleable, like looks a little bit like a donut without a hole, it'll turn rigid and will have the sickle shape. And now you have all these terrible things that can happen where the red blood cells clump up. They cause a clot or a vaso-occlusive type phenomenon, and also then make you vulnerable to infections at those sites. You also eventually do occlude and destroy your spleen if you have sickle cell anemia, which makes you vulnerable to a host of bacterial infections as well. So this is the disease that she was studying.
Over the course of several years, she was awarded several grants to study sickle cell in children, and in 1986 she published the results of a long-term study linked in the show notes that showed long-term penicillin can prevent infections in people with sickle cell disease. This ended up being so important and successful that it laid the groundwork for screening for sickle cell disease in the general population to administer penicillin prophylactically. And with only a year after she published this paper, 40 states had adopted some form of screening. So that's lasting change in a very
Yeah,
immediate sense.
huge, absolutely huge. To this day, sickle cell disease does not really get the attention that it deserves in terms of need for research and improvement in people's lives. And there is definitely a racial bias here. Cystic fibrosis, which, is a horrible disease, but actually affects far fewer people, gets a lot more attention. And there's no doubt, Josh, that race has a component in this because sickle cell disease does affect predominantly Black people, people of African descent. Um, Penicillin does a fantastic job of protecting people against these encapsulated organisms, which is the bacteria that our spleen helps us kill. So, like I said before, just with enough time with sickle cell disease, the spleen becomes infarcted and dies. And so those kids are essentially immune compromised. But if you just give them a simple prophylaxis, wow, all of a sudden you prevent them from dying, from going into the hospital. It's really a wonderful thing. And as to universal screening, chances are pretty darn good, actually, might be close to 100% now, that if you were born in the United States, you got a little drop of blood taken from your heel before you left the hospital, and you were screened for several diseases, one of which definitely is for sickle cell.
We call this the Achilles procedure, like the Greek myth.
No, we don't. It's called a heel prick blood spot. What are you doing?
My name's better.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so three of many fantastic physicians to fet during Black History Month. And that's it for this week. As always, we love to hear your comments, questions, and feedback. If you'd like to support us spiritually, emotionally, or financially, links to do that are in the show notes, along with links for further reading. We're on X, we're on Facebook, we're even on TikTok.
I'm not calling it that. It's Twitter. Damn you. Sorry.
If there's a social media, we'll be there.
Yeah.
This show is produced by me with a lot of help from Dr. Santhosh and friends. Our theme music is composed by Rachel Leisure. And until next time, keep a song in your heart, soap on your hands, a shot in your arm, a spin on your globe. And once you've done all those things, find somewhere to explore. And happy travels.
Happy Black History Month, everybody.